Hey everybody, this is a piece uh, by Chaia Heller. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. It could be Chaia, but I think it's Chaia. I'm not sure though. I might be wrong. But she's from. Uh, this piece is from the Institute for Social Ecology website. Um, and her most recent blog, and this is the piece I'm reading today, is a blog post from 2003, I believe. November 20th, 2023. 2023, that's what I meant to say. Jesus Christ. All right, and the piece is called Authoritarianism, Anti-Jewish Racism, and the Israel-Hamas War, an open letter to the left. I'm not a scholar of the history or politics of Palestine or Israel, but I'm Jewish, queer, a mother, a feminist, and a leftist who mourns this tragic moment in history. I'm a leftist fearful and grieving for Palestinians, Israelis, non-Israeli Jews, and Muslims across this tattered world. If I'm sure of anything, it's that this moment will forever remain a dark stain on the already blood-soaked fabric of human history. As I write these pages, Palestinians face an existential war as the Israeli government attempts to eradicate Hamas. My decision to write about the left's relationship with authoritarianism and anti-Jewish racism comes not from a cynical or relativizing, quote, whataboutism, but suggests the issues I raise here are more worthy of the left's critical attention. Sorry, I fucked up that sentence. My decision to write about the left's relationship with authoritarianism and anti-Jewish racism comes not from a cynical or relativizing, quote, whataboutism that suggests the issues I raise here are more worthy of the left's critical attention. The left is providing a requisite and robust focus on mass Palestinian deaths, casualties, and complex historical realities. My purpose in what follows is to address two problems emerging in tandem amidst the current war. A left challenge to present a principled response to dynamics of authoritarianism and rising anti-Jewish racism. By simultaneously addressing these challenges, we may enrich our historical and current understanding of authoritarian and racist dynamics woven into this disaster in the making. New section. Authoritarianism and left quietism. Are we on the right side of history? The authoritarian Israeli government led by Netanyahu is falling into the trap set by Hamas. For 2 years, Hamas planned with the assistance of countries like Iran to utilize overkill tactics including execution-style murder, torture, rape, and dismemberment while publicly celebrating these acts on social media. Hamas's strategy is working. Humiliated and vengeful, the far-right Israeli government is doing the unthinkable, obliterating Gaza's already fragile infrastructure while decimating the population of Gaza, half of whom are children. The left and progressives around the world call for the Israeli government to stop the invasion of Gaza, immediately allow in humanitarian aid, and to end the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. Leftists also call to stop Jewish religious zealots unjustly settled in the West Bank who are terrorizing and murdering Palestinians. Yet the left has no call to Hamas. Many on the left wonder why their comrade supporter remains silent about Hamas's role in this disaster. For the last 15 years, the authoritarian Hamas government in Gaza has been marked by acts of corruption that include the diversion of funds for Gazan aid toward military efforts that made this war possible. And while Hamas governs Palestinians in Gaza, its leadership doesn't prioritize the safety of its citizens serving as human shields against Israeli attacks. When the left supports or turns a blind eye to Hamas, we have to ask ourselves a question. Are we on the right side of history? To grasp the logic shaping this war, it's key to consider the logic of authoritarianism. As political philosopher Marie Bookchin explains, authoritarianism deploys an instrumental means to ends logic, wherein unethical means are justified by desired ends. Footnote. Marie Bookchin, the primary creator of a body of revolutionary theory called social ecology, drew many insights from the Frankfurt School regarding the place and meaning of reason in the revolutionary tradition. For Bookchin, instrumental or, quote, conventional reason is suited for everyday problem solving used in computational or practical endeavors related to such realms as engineering. He asserted, though, that ethical reason is necessary for building a foundation of a good society that is accountable to a shared and transparent emancipatory logic of non-hierarchy, direct democracy, social justice, anti-racism, ecology, and a moral economy. In the spirit of Gen Z, I advise readers to Google Marie Bookchin or consult Bookchin's important volume, The Philosophy of Social Ecology, published in 1996, for a concise reflection on how progressives often failed to note that Hamas's objectives as an authoritarian movement contradict most of their political ideals. See Helen Lewis's article, The Progressives Who Flunked the Hamas Test, published in The Atlantic, October 13th, 2023. If Hamas uses military means that leads to the mass deaths of Israeli and Gazan civilians to achieve their ends, then so be it. The same instrumental logic goes for the Israeli government. If the Israeli government takes the life of every single Gazan, so be it. The left's silence or support for Hamas means support for the movement to establish an authoritarian and patriarchal ethno-state, with fundamentalist Islam governing Palestinians and a political culture that brutally disciplines women and LGBTQ+ people while thwarting any hope for democracy. Support for Hamas represents a break in the logic of anti-authoritism that has marked the left in recent decades. Increasingly, the left has generated a good deal of optimism from libertarian struggles that embody libertarian socialist ideals such as autonomy, solidarity, sex-gender equality, non-hierarchy, social justice, and ecology. The Zapatista freedom movement in Chiapas, Mexico, for example, has uplifted the left by promoting values of democracy, gender equality, and cultural autonomy for indigenous peoples. Footnote: for a concise introduction and overview of the Zapatista movement, see Kurt Hochbart's article, The Zapatista Revolution is Not Over. End footnote. The Kurdish freedom movement based in Rojava, or northern Syria, has also captured the left's imagination by promoting anti-statism/anti-nationalism, democracy, ecology, and feminism while working for a secular and ethnically inclusive society. Footnote: there are many beautifully written texts on the Kurdish freedom movement. As I'm particularly moved by the movement's emphasis on feminism as central to the broader anti-authoritarian revolution, I recommend those interested in the Kurdish women's movement to see Dilar Derik, The Kurdish Women's Movement, History, Theory, Practice, published in 2022. End footnote. Revolutionary Kurds choose militarism only in self-defense as they protect their communities from the Syrian government, Turkey, ISIS, or other invading forces. The left pivot away from, quote, tanky strategies of terror and irrational violence flags another step forward for a left striving to align ends with means. In the U.S., black scholars and leaders, including Modibo Kadeli, Lorenzo Comboa Ervin, Kali Akuno, and Ashanti Alston, also signed a definitive break with the authoritarian left that promoted nationalist and hierarchical forms of organization and movement building. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote: Comboa Irvin's most recent book is a particularly insightful discussion of the relationship between black anarchism and the broader current abolitionist movement to end racist policing and incarceration in the U.S. that targets mainly black and brown people. See Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition. And footnote. Footnote: Kali Akuno is a key black leader, scholar, and founder of Cooperation Jackson, an anti-authoritarian organization working to create a self-organizing solidarity economy in Jackson, Mississippi. See the book Jackson Rising Redux, Lessons on Building the Future in the Present, published in 2023. Footnote. Ashanti Alston is an anarchist scholar, activist, former member of the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army. Earlier in his life, he was a political prisoner for over 10 years and currently works in the Jericho movement to free U.S. political prisoners. Alston is the author of Anarchism, Zapatismo, and the Black Panthers, published in 2006. Footnote. Modibo Kadali is a longtime scholar and organizer active in the civil rights, Black Power, and Pan-African movements. For a look into Kadali's engaging discussion of the relationship between direct democracy, ecology, and social liberation, see Modibo Kadali's Pan-African Social Ecology, Speeches, Conversations, Essays, published in 2019. End footnote. Many Black anti-authoritarian leaders embraced a crucial political legacy that includes the Black Panther Party and Black Power movements that spanned from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s. Yet they describe a political evolution that moved beyond authoritarian and patriarchal features of these movements that led to a different kind of Black freedom movement based on principles of non-hierarchy, solidarity, anti-racism, feminism, abolition, and a solidarity economy. Kadali's call for a pan-African social ecology is a reach for an entirely new paradigm where solidarity among Black communities across the continents transcends a vision where nationalism was the only unifying path forward. What's striking about this anti-authoritarian leftist turn generally is an explicit critique of and critical engagement with Marxist-Leninist frameworks marked by an authoritarian and instrumental logic of means ends. Increasingly, the most evocative and dynamic left leaders reject status solutions in favor of a non-authoritarian future that opens a way for a utopian politics. The Zapatistas' assertion that, quote, another world is possible, unquote, continues to inspire millions on the left who also seek a future free of cis-heteropatriarchy, state power, capitalism, as well as religious or ethnic hatred. And yet, here we are, facing a devastating war between the state of Israel and Hamas. And yet, again, the left's message ranges from apologetic and unprincipled to quietist. If before October 7th the left was drawn to the path taken by the Zapatistas and the Kurdish revolutionaries, then clearly we've lost our way. I feel as though, and this is just my personal opinion, I feel as though Heller is using the word the left in way too loose of a term. I would say that the left that is interested in the Zapatistas and the Kurdish freedom struggle are is not the left in general. I would say that Palestine has always been a more important issue than either the struggles of the Zapatistas or the Kurds. So I think that this use of the word, I think she's might be talking in an echo chamber here, because that is fundamentally not, those movements have fundamentally been much less important. And this wasn't just due to this wasn't just after October 7th, but long, long before it. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Calls to, quote, free Palestine or, quote, end the occupation fail to note that this war is not unfolding in a vacuum where the Israeli government is the sole actor driving this humanitarian disaster. The left must call for an end of the far-right Israeli government, Hamas, and other religious fundamentalist authoritarian movements so that peace and democracy seeking Palestinians and Israelis can get down to the long and hard work of building a viable, flourishing, and possible future for both peoples. The left needs to recapture its commitment to ethical rather than instrumentalism, grounded in a shared set of libertarian socialist principles. When we stand accountable to anti-authoritarian principles, we can see that we can't cherry-pick particular features of authoritarian institutions were inclined to criticize while remaining silent about others. A stunning instance of left instrumentalism surfaced when Russell Rickford, a progressive professor at Cornell University, was so emotionally overcome with news of the Hamas massacre he lost his ethical mooring. Wikipedia says Russell Rickford is an associate professor of history at Cornell University. He specialized in African American political culture after World War II, the Black radical tradition, and transnational social movements. In his book, We Are an African People, Independent Education, Black Power, and the Radical Imagination, received the 2016 Hooks Institute National Book Award and the 2017 OAH Liberty Legacy Foundation Award. He is currently working on a book about Guyana and African American radical politics in the 1970s. Back to the text. In a speech to students, Russell Rickford shared that despite his general abhorrence for targeting civilians, he was, quote, exhilarated by Hamas's actions that allowed him to finally, quote, breathe. Rickford suggested that anyone who didn't share his exhilaration in Hamas's brutal violence, quote, would not be human, end quote. Footnote. See the article, Cornell professor, quote, exhilarated by Hamas attack, defends remarks, in the Cornell Daily Sun, October 16th, 2023. See also the article, Cornell leaders condemn professors, quote, professor, quote, exhilarated by Hamas attack, published in Inside Higher Ed, October 18th, 2023. A longer excerpt from Rickford's talk reads, quote, Hamas has shifted the balance of power. Hamas has punched the illusion of invincibility. That's what they've done. You don't have to be a Hamas supporter to recognize that. And in those first few hours, even as horrific acts were being carried out, many of which we would not learn about until later, there are many Gazans of goodwill, many Palestinians of conscience, who abhor violence as do you, as do I, who abhor the targeting of civilians as do you, as do I, who were able to breathe, exclamation point, ... They were able to breathe, exclamation point. For the first time in years, exclamation point. It was exhilarating. It was exhilarating. It was energizing. And if they weren't exhilarated by this, the challenge to the monopoly of violence, by this shifting of the balance of power, then they would not be human. I was exhilarated. Exclamation point. End quote. Russell Rickford. End footnote. Unless the left is to become unmoored from a shared humanity, we can't be exhilarated by Hamas's rape, torture, and dismemberment of civilian children, youth, and elderly, while also, quote, abhorring the targeting of civilians. When we qualify our support for the egregious actions of authoritarian movements like Hamas or Hezbollah, we tarnish the ideals held by Zapatistas, Kurdish, and black revolutionaries we fervently admire. By failing to speak out against the inhumane targeting of civilians, the left implies a condescendingly bleak vision of Palestine's future. As leftists, we need to ask ourselves whether we see Palestinians as incapable of creating movements for democracy and social justice. Do we believe, for, quote, cultural reasons, end quote, that Palestine's only recourse is to be led by an authoritarian movement that commits rapacious massacres of civilians while disciplining its own people with a fundamentalist religious government that controls women's bodies and sexuality while making the lives of queer people unviable? Leftists weighing in on this war show disrespect to Palestinian leftists when we fail to recognize Palestinians' challenge in fending off authoritarian forces that sabotage and even criminalize their struggle for freedom. By emphasizing elements of, quote, immoral equivalence, end quote, at play in this war between Israel and Hamas, I do not suggest an equivalence of power. I do suggest, however, that leftist critiques fail when we focus mainly on powerful governments while demonizing the people, civilians governed by those institutions. I also believe that the left critiques fail when we romanticize sets of people or nations who lead or are governed. Well, I think I fucked this up. I also believe that left critiques fail when romanticizing sets of people or nations who lead or are governed by the powerless. I think there just might be a typo in that sentence. I can't really follow it. When we assume a humanitarian perspective, we hold everyone from the most to the least powerful to anti-authoritarian principles. The left must transcend a history of romanticizing the oppressed and powerless, seeing suffering as a sign of morality. Suffering is not a virtue. It's a sign of an ethically wronged humanity and a cause for empathy, compassion, and principled humanitarian action that supports people in their struggle to be free of suffering. Virtue lies not in oppression or powerlessness. It lies in our set of shared ideals as well as a liberatory vision that embodies those ideals. If we've learned anything from the tragic history of Palestine/Israel, it's that persecution and genocide are not redemptive. It is a gross understatement to say that the state of Israel did not become, quote, a light unto all nations, end quote. In turn, Hamas, as representative of the oppressed Palestinian people, is no exemplar of left ideals. By ceasing to romanticize the oppressed, we can better avoid the trap of deeming as, quote, friend virtually any enemy of our enemy, no matter how unprincipled they may be. The authoritarian enemy of our authoritarian enemies simply furthers the irrational logic of inhumanity we seek to transcend. When we overturn the dustbin of history, outpours a sooty stream of ash. Dehumanization doesn't often lead to freedom and justice. Dehumanization tends to lead to more dehumanization if and when axes of power are inversed. And when we take the broad view of history, we see that power dynamics can change on a dime. This is precisely why the left needs a clear set of ethical principles that grounds how we think and respond to authoritarianism in any humanitarian crisis. We must be ready to address unanticipated changes that open the way forward for possible emancipatory futures. Leftists must also remember that institutions are more powerful than the individuals who comprise them. The logic of authoritarian structures like the state is far more commanding than the individuals who comprise any state, no matter how democratic or exemplary the members of that democratic state profess to be. This is true in the case of representative democracies such as the US, Italy, Hungary, or Israel, nations that may be on their way to becoming explicitly anti-democratic regimes. If the Zapatistas, Rojavan Kurds, or black anti-authoritarian leaders were offered a state of their own, they would rightly refuse it on principle. These movements are much needed examples of what the left can be or how far the non-authoritarian left has come. Zapatistas and Kurds who push back daily against the state understand that the state, and authoritarianism generally, have a way of, quote, becoming us, end quote, as individuals embody the authoritarian features of the institutions that govern them. We shouldn't be surprised when the beleaguered people doled out their own state begin to behave like a state. This is true in the case of Israel, Holocaust refugees fleeing to the British Protectorate of Palestine, as well in the case of many nations liberated from colonial rule throughout Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Oppressed people tend to overthrow despotic colonial states, only to create new despotic states built from the authoritarian logic of the states that preceded them. For the left to abide by an ethical logic amidst the murderous chaos unfolding before us, we must explicitly extend an anti-authoritarian critique to every organization, institution, and nation-state driving this catastrophe. Just as we must prefigure the good society to come in our words and actions, we must critique the political formations that disfigure humanity, unleashing indescribable human suffering. Otherwise, we show disrespect to a left legacy that spans from the Paris Commune and the Spanish Civil War all the way to the Zapatista, Kurdish, and black revolutionaries to whom we look to today for inspiration and a sense of hope. New section. Toward a fully anti-racist left, addressing anti-Jewish racism. To regain its morale, the left has another task: to become a fully anti-racist movement by addressing anti-Jewish racism. As I noted earlier, this assertion may seem ill-timed as Palestinians face an existential war, when the Israeli government is committing unspeakable acts of humanity against Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and when Palestinians in the West Bank are being terrorized by Jewish religious fanatics. How could it be fitting to discuss Jews as a racist target? Why speak of anti-Jewish racism at all? Because the left can be infused with the logic of, quote, both and, called upon by Israeli-American Rabbi Amichai Laulavi. Footnote. Rabbi Amichai Laulavi is a New York-based Israeli-American rabbi, peace activist, and, quote, storyteller, who co-founded the dynamic and experimental queer-positive, quote, God-optional, and religiously and ethnically inclusive project Lab/Shul, to learn more about Rabbi, that's a link to a website. In an interview on NPR, Rabbi Amichai offers a soulfully articulate discussion of a, quote, both-and approach to the Israel-Palestine war. See the article, What a Rabbi Hopes to Offer the Wounded and Grieving in Israel During the Weeks After the October 7th Massacre. Interview with Ari Shapiro in the National Public Radio. And footnote, there is no false dilemma between showing grace towards Palestinians or Jews. I believe that we can stretch our hearts mightily to show compassion towards both peoples, even if in this very moment Palestine is facing a genocidal war. Even at unspeakably painful times as these, we must retain our humanity, and expansive humanitarianism allows us to hold the vulnerability of the Palestinian people and that of Jewish people both within and outside of Israel. Though fraught and difficult, I believe that holding a both-and perspective is crucial for our left striving to undo all forms of racism while engaging in an internationalist principle of a radically inclusive humanism. As noted earlier, as the left is effectively shining a crucial light on the unfolding Palestinian tragedy, they're in a space which, too, at least briefly, home in an anti-Jewish racism that is also spiking in this moment. Okay, there's some typos here. And I think what the sentence tried to say, as also noted earlier, as the left is effectively shining a crucial light on the unfolding Palestinian tragedy, there is a space in which to, at least briefly, hone in on anti-Jewish racism that is also spiking in this moment. I am offering what follows. In offering what follows, do not compare the suffering of Jews in Israel to the suffering of Palestinians. Again, I'm saying the left can hold both and. Through an expansive logic of both and, we can explore three reasons out of many why the left may include anti-Jewish racism in its anti-authoritarianism and anti-racist vision as at this historical juncture. First, we must consider that religious hatred and anti-Jewish racism is what brought us here, causing Jewish Holocaust refugees to flee to Palestine/Israel. Second, we must grasp that many Jews across the world still see Israel-Palestine as the only place of refuge should anti-Jewish racism make their life untenable in the countries in which they live. Third, it's key to note that Jews and Muslims around the world are currently being targeted by racism as a result of this war. It's a painful truth that the rise in anti-Jewish racism fortifies Netanyahu's commitment to continue this vengeful mission to root out Hamas, killing thousands of Palestinians in the process. How do we address anti-Jewish racism in this moment? We can think beyond the truism that rightly posits that criticism of Israel isn't inherently anti-Semitic or racist. We may take this assertion further by heeding the words of Ibram X. Kendi, who teaches that, quote, not being racist, end quote, does not make us actively anti-racist. Footnote. Ibram X. Kendi's groundbreaking book transforms how we think of racism and anti-racism, establishing, quote, anti-racism as a verb rather than a noun. It's insufficient to state that one isn't anti-Semitic or isn't an anti-Jewish racist. For critiquing Israel or for whatever reason, we need to articulate what active anti-racist solidarity with Jews looks like on the left. To overcome a centuries-long history of left anti-Jewish racism, we may consider three more objectives that include: 1, understanding Jewish history; 2, confronting and dispelling racist myths that dehumanize Jewish people; and 3, showing solidarity and compassion for Jewish comrades both within and outside of Israel. I use the term anti-Jewish racism because, quote, anti-Semite is the product of a racist linguistic invention made in 1862 by German pundit Wilhelm Marr, who racialized European Jews as Semites to establish them as non-European. In addition, another reason that Wilhelm Marr, if there's other pieces on here I have that reference Wilhelm Marr was also conforming to like the political correctness of the time. It was considered like improper to attack Jews on religious grounds. Wilhelm Marr was trying to put forward like a secular anti-Jewish prejudice. Also important that I think is not talked about ever is that Wilhelm Marr, like Richard Wagner, has a background in radical left politics. I'm not as much of an expert on Wilhelm Marr, but I think Wilhelm Marr, for instance, introduced anarchism to a large extent into Germany. As I said, 1862. This would have been very early, but he also, I think, he also had like certain kind of like radical left perspectives. Like I don't think Wilhelm Marr viewed himself as some kind of like. I mean, I'm not an expert, so I'm kind of talking out of my ass here, just riffing off the cuff. But I think Wilhelm Marr, at least in some certain sense, even if he might not be, there's a certain leftism in the thought of Wilhelm Marr, which is important to consider. And he always emphasized too that he didn't hate Jews as individuals. Like he didn't hate Jews as like, when he saw, like he didn't hate like Jews as individuals. What he hated was their kind of like their collective being, right? Which he viewed as like, to my understanding at least, like a particularist special interest group sucking the life out of the nation, which is fundamentally like what was I going to say? So it's not this is my understanding, and that's part of why Wilhelm Marr like racialized it, is because Wilhelm Marr wasn't like a traditionalist. Like Wilhelm Marr wasn't like someone who like viewed in like, to my understanding at least, like viewed like I don't think he was religious or anything like that. I think he might have been an atheist. Again, I'm not sure. And I think that he was like I don't think he had like the view of like I don't think he was a counter-revolutionary, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know. I think he was some kind of radical, and I think some kind of liberal, I think. I'm pretty sure. But again, my knowledge isn't exact. But just real quick, if you go to, and not that this is a source that's worth, that necessarily means something, but if you just go to the German Wikipedia and you type in Wilhelm Marr, it says, Wilhelm Marr lived from 1819 to 1904 and was a German journalist. He was the first to propagate anarchism in the German-speaking world. Later, he advocated radical democratic positions. In 1879, he founded the first anti-Semitic political organization in the German Empire, the Anti-Semitic League. In doing so, he coined the new term anti-Semitism for a racially rather than a religiously based hostility to Jews. Yeah, but I'm not, like, again, I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked here. But, yeah. Uh, what was I saying? Yeah, but basically, that Wilhelm Marr, kind of was like almost like a first person to, like, well, not the first person, but like I don't know who would be the first person, but like to shift around terms in order to make what he said seem more digestible to average people. A racialized, right now in this day and age, we view uh, racialized characterizations of people and as like, the essential characteristics of those people as abhorrent. But this was like like not maybe like across the board. This was a very popular idea in intellectual history. Not necessarily just from the right either, right? You think of like eugenics. Eugenics had way more of broader appeal than just in like to like right wing radicals or something like that, right? So if you think of like J.A. Hobson or like the Fabians, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, H.G. Wells, who's the other guy? I can't think of his name. Bernard Shaw. All those people believed in like eugenics, and all those kinds of things. So this kind of like racialization of Jews was in a certain sense like politically correct at the time. Whereas traditional religious hatred of Jews was way more taboo. And I think that also Wilhelm Marr was kind of coined the term anti-Semitism, at least partially. Obviously, it's more consistent with his overall worldview, but to avoid libel suits. Especially considering, and this was important because he viewed, I know that Wilhelm Marr viewed like the law, like that, like Jewish people had like colonized the German state, and so he was always at risk of speaking truth to power. There's always that, and that's like a key thing that makes anti-Semitism unique, is that the Jews are powerful. The Jews are superhuman as opposed to subhuman. The Jews are clever, small, collective, diabolic group that conspire with each other to rip off the public, to exploit the public, exploit the majority of the members of the country in which they're operating in, to exploit the world. There's very much a sense of like freeing the people from the Jew in anti-Semitic thinking. But that's just my thoughts. Sorry, I'm just riffing here, but I just read something on Wilhelm Marr, so I was excited to spit about him. Marr's pro-German League of Anti-Semites introduced anti-Semite into popular parlance while creating the first popular movement organized solely around Jew hate. Social scientists and others, including Jews, adopted Marr's term, which led all Jews and people of Middle Eastern descent to see themselves as fictive anti-Semites, ironically leading non-Jews to see themselves as victims of anti-Semitism. And this is why anti-Semitism is like hyphen out, because it's not really what he's talking about. Is like a is like a construction of the mind, like Semitism. Um, Additionally, anti-Semitism did have a very particular place for Jews as such, not just people from the Middle East, but Jews as such. And this is a very problematic thing because if you people like Malcolm X or Edward Said or like other people who say like I can't be anti-Semitic, I'm a Semite, kind of like really not understanding the specifically like anti-Jewish character of anti-Semitism. Obviously, anti-Semitism can, not necessarily, but can often include a ticket thinking about like all kinds of other racialized groups. That's what, as in like right-wing anti-Semitism, right? But that not necessarily need be the case. For instance, people who are not white often can be, or not often are. That's too extreme. But people who are non-white, as well as white people, can be anti-Semitic, even if they're so-called Semites. Anyway, if we successfully retire fictive racist terms like Aryan, Negroid, and Mongoloid in the 20th century, in the 21st we can retire, quote, Semite, quote, anti-Negroidism, quote, anti-Mongoloidism, or, quote, anti-Semitism, or unacceptable racist terms for anti-black racism, anti-Asian racism, and anti-Jewish racism. Quote, anti-Semitism, even if you spell it anti-Semitism without the hyphen or the dash, is thus no longer an accurate anti-racist or acceptable way to talk about Jew hate. I really strongly disagree with this. I don't think that I think that anti-Semitism precedes the biological notion. Obviously, you're using it kind of anachronistically. It's a anti-Semitism was a neologism at one point, but you can describe anti-Judaism or anti-Jewish hate prior to its racialization, right? And you can describe it after that, and you can also say anti-Jewish racism maybe isn't, or anti-Jewish prejudice may not be necessarily essentialist, right? For instance, if you don't have the obviously converts were viewed with suspicion, but Jews could redeem themselves in some sense, be accepted by the larger community if they converted, and that's a crucial thing, right? One can be redeemed and included in humanity by departing ways, by assimilating, or by not assimilating. Assimilating is not true, not the best word for it, but by abandoning your so-called particularism and become part of the community by turning your back on this on like by via conversion, Jews can redeem themselves. I think that doesn't have the same kind of racist tone. And then I think you could also say racism is a neologism, right? As well, you could say that like any kind of conflict between two separate groups, you could that are like different in some way, you could, you work back into the future and call it racism. And that wouldn't be quite accurate either. So I think that, yeah, and then also I think I think a lot of racism just in contemporary times, just like for instance anti-black racism, often doesn't have the biological features of yesteryear. It usually has a more of a cultural concept of like what like the Black American psyche is like, and what the so-called culture of poverty and bad attitudes and like resistance to being upstanding citizens or something like that, and preferring handouts or and crime as a means to make a living, as opposed to being industrious Americans or something like that. They don't necessarily, like, the most racism that or at least, I mean, I'm not an expert, so I'm talking out my ass, but like, it seems like a lot of racism, including anti-Semitism, doesn't have this kind of like biological tone to it. And even people that are racist, that's why people that are like racist can have like, you know, they're good ones, right? I don't know if you ever heard this term when you were around, but I don't know if you ever, I'm sure where I grew up wasn't as racist as other places, but people would say, there's black people and then there's N-words, right? And that kind of like indicates to me like that this like biological type of racism, this like racism that's like of like a biological sort, about the inherent nature of people based on like genetics, was very short-lived in the overall scheme of like prejudice. If it seems like it almost lasted less than 100 years. If it starts in like the mid 19th century, and well, maybe that's not true. It didn't last less than 100 years. But in any case, it's not politically. It's no longer politically correct, not for good reason, to say those things. But as with political correctness, you always have dog whistles and things kind of like creeping into through the back door of discourse. So I don't know, like anti-Jewish. I would not reduce anti-Semitism to. I'd be cautious about reducing anti-Semitism to anti-Jewish racism. But that's just an opinion of mine. Footnote: for a more detailed discussion of the shift from, quote, anti-Semitism to, quote, anti-Jewish racism, and to learn about an instance of left anti-Jewish racism, see Chaia Heller's article Questioning Ajulan's Jewish Question, published in Harbinger, a journal of social ecology. End footnote. And for my own purposes, that's footnote 11. New section, Understanding Jewish History. Learning about Jewish histories is key to understanding anti-Jewish racism. In so doing, we may learn about Jewish histories preceding the current and historically unprecedented 75-year window of relative inclusion for Jews in the U.S., Israel/Palestine, and in other countries across the world that have grown more tolerant of Jews. Footnote: a discerning discussion of Jewish exceptionalism is found in Tony Michel's article, Tony Michel's article, Is America, quote, different? A critique of American Jewish exceptionalism. End footnote. In the U.S., the 75-year window called, quote, Jewish American exceptionalism began after the close of the Holocaust, becoming increasingly, quote, open in the 1960s as Jews of European descent acquired, for better or for worse, status as provisional white people in the United States. Footnote: Karen Brodkin offers an elaborate discussion of how Ashkenazi Jews became white in the U.S. See Karen Brodkin's book, How Jews Became White Folks, and What That Says About Race in America, published in 1988. For a critique of that book, and a lot of the thoughts of it, check out the pieces I have on here by Balázs Berkovits. End footnote. To understand, however, centuries of Jewish hardship and subjugation, we need to take a long view of Jewish history. When we look before this, quote, exceptionalist era, end quote, we see Jewish history as riddled with long periods of cyclical violence and subjugation. A long view allows leftists to better understand what many Jews fear, a window of safety and inclusion that is anomalous, fragile, and entirely capable of shattering. History reminds Jews that this window can and will implode if political anti-Jewish racism regains ascendancy. Understanding Jewish history means grasping the pre-Christian, Christian, and Islamic features of anti-Jewish religious hatred in the pre-modern period that are still active today. It means also comprehending modern forms of racialized European Jew hate that emerged in the 19th century when anti-Jewish pseudoscientists determined Jews a distinct and inferior racial type. Less than a century later, Hitler used the, quote, racialized Jew, end quote, to justify a Nazi program that incinerated 2/3 of European Jews determined racially, quote, impure. Footnote: for an extraordinarily accessible and detailed history of the pseudoscience of racialized typologizing, see Joseph L. Graves and Alan H. Goodman's book, Racism Not Race, published in 2021. End footnote. The history of Middle Eastern and North African Jews is also central to understanding anti-Jewish racism. The history of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews is varied and cyclical, marked by periods of relative tolerance, also followed by periods of exclusion and violence. The exodus of both groups of Jews to Palestine/Israel, where they now constitute a majority of Israeli Jews, signals their fragile and fraught status in their previous host countries. Understanding Jewish histories helps the left understand again why Ashkenazi people fled to Palestine/Israel. It also sheds light on why Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews fled to Israel/Palestine. Let me reread the sentence. Understanding Jewish histories helps the left understand again why Ashkenazi people fled to Palestine/Israel. It also sheds light on why Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews fled to Israel/Palestine in the years after the state was established, as they faced bigotry and exclusion in their host countries and thus sought asylum. I don't know why she insists on saying Palestine/Israel, and Israel/Palestine, and then referring to it as like the state that was established. It's Israel. What's being referred to as Israel. It seems to me, maybe I'm misreading something. As we address new section, confronting and dispelling racist myths. As we address anti-Jewish racism, we can identify and interrupt racist myths that include a particularly dangerous notion of a timeless and universal Jewish power endowed with nearly superhuman political, financial, and cultural capacities. This myth leads leftists to view Jewish comrades as sharing a financial and political power that makes them invulnerable to racism. Footnote: I was one of a group of 9 social ecologists who wrote a reflection piece addressing the anti-Jewish tropes contained within Abdullah Öcalan's. I can never pronounce the name. I think it's Öcalan. I think it has like this. It looks like Öcalan, but I think it's Öcalan. I'm not sure. I might be saying it wrong. The Sociology of Freedom, published in 2020, Öcalan, I can't remember how to say his name. Öcalan is the symbolic leader of a Kurdish freedom movement politically aligned with social ecology. We were surprised to find pages of 19th century style tropes about Jewish power that Öcalan described as part of a larger, quote, Jewish ideology. It's important to note that this book was put out by, I believe, PM Press, and nobody batted a fucking eye. I think there's was a book put out by AK Press where it's like, trivializes anti-Semitism in the Middle East. Anyway, As Öcalan is the symbolic leader of a Kurdish freedom movement politically aligned with social ecology, we were surprised to find pages of 19th century style tropes about Jewish power that Öcalan described as part of a larger, quote, Jewish ideology, end quote. When our group met with Kurdish leaders and Öcalan scholars to discuss the issue, we were disappointed when they denied that the pages contained anything that could be considered anti-Semitic. Many in our group wondered if respected leftists are able or unwilling to address 19th century style anti-Jewish racism like what is found in the forged tract, The Protocols of Zion. Then how will the left ever be able to address other instances of anti-Jewish racism that emerge in discussions of Palestine, Israel, and generally? To read our group's short reflection piece, Reflections on the Anti-Semitic Content of Öcalan's The Sociology of Freedom. End footnote. This myth also distorts leftist understanding of the actual history of capitalism and the geopolitical dynamics of state bodies globally. It's not that religious power is itself mythical. Powerful religions such as Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism have indeed driven statist political agendas for centuries. But there exists no comparable centuries-long, quote, Jewish power. In discussing Jews generally, we need a better way to distinguish between Jews and those referred to as, quote, non-Jews, end quote. As a brief aside, I'll explain here why I chose the acronym, quote, Descendants of Religious Majorities, parenthesis, DORM, end parenthesis, as a way... Oh, shit. Oh, that was bad formatting here. As a brief aside, I'll explain why I chose the acronym Descendants of Religious Minorities, or DORM, as a way to refer to people who are not Jewish. Footnote. Additionally, the Yiddish Hebrew term goy and, quote, Gentile, derived from the term, quote, goy, mean, quote, those who belong to a, quote, nation, end quote, meaning that class of people consisting of everyone but Jews, but belong to no, quote, nation. Over time, quote, goy and, quote, Gentile ceased to reflect Jewish exclusion from nation/societies, but instead reinforced a stereotype of Jews as clannish and exclusionary. As previously stated, replacing, quote, Gentile with, quote, non-Jew has the effect of reproducing the racist notion that Jews see those who aren't Jewish as, quote, non-people. The acronym then shifts from a framing of descendants of religious majorities as a, quote, non-Jewish, non-people, end quote, to a framing that is substantive and illustrative. In other words, this acronym suggests what descendants of religious majorities are, descendants of religious majorities, rather than what they're not. End footnote. First, the prefix, quote, non, invokes a notion of negation and exclusion, which is an unideal linguistic intervention for Jews racialized as exclusionary or, quote, clannish. Second, the term, quote, non-Jew marks subjects the way, quote, whiteness unmarks descendants of white Europeans. Third, the word, quote, majority signals the 42% of the global descendant population of major world religions, including atheism, as compared to Jews at 0.2%. The acronym DORM then removes an exclusionary, quote, non, marks religious descendancy, and notes the stunning ratio between Jews and descendants of majority religions, helping us to see and consider the meaning of descendant membership in majority religions. Returning to anti-Jewish racism, it is not surprising that Jews raised outside of Israel tend to believe myths of Jewish power as they share the same culture as their descendants of religious majority comrades. As a result, Jews often find themselves pitted against each other as left groups debate whether to address, downplay, or ignore instances of anti-Jewish racism that inevitably arise in left spaces. Jews who see themselves as invulnerable to racism or believe that minimizing it protects Jews are often reluctant to address instances of anti-Jewish racism. Other Jews may be aware of being directly impacted by anti-Jewish racism or understand it as a leftist issue. These individuals may speak out against instances of left anti-Jewish racism only to find them assailed by leftists that include left Jewish comrades. How are myths of Jewish power relevant to the current calamity of this war? Myths of Jews wielding great political, financial, and cultural power foreclose on the left's ability to see Jewish vulnerability. If we don't, quote, see this myth, we can't see the cause and effects of Jew-hating racist speech and violence that are, again, mounting as a result of the Israeli government's actions, seen as a powerful cabal. Jews are targets for those who hold them responsible for the current war and seek revenge. New section: Left solidarity and empathy for Jewish comrades. In the current crisis, understanding anti-Jewish racism can build bridges of solidarity and empathy between Jewish and descendants of religious majority leftists. As the British comic and writer David Baddiel notes, Jews are one of the only ethnic groups regarded as undeserving of cultural sensitivity afforded to other ethnic minorities. Footnote: see David Baddiel's book Jews Don't Count, How Identity Politics Failed One Particular Identity. I remember I didn't actually listen to the interviews or like the podcast or whatever, but Working Class History, who I believe is affiliated with Libcom, I get their emails, they're like newsletters, and this is the one book that they chose to critique as like a bad analysis of race, but it's important, and I think it's telling. It's interesting that the one bad book on race is one that criticizes the left for not taking anti-Semitism seriously. Anyway, end footnote. For example, descendants of religious majorities may be insensitive to how signs reading, quote, Jews out of Israel, end quote, or, quote, from the river to the sea, end quote, may impact their Jewish comrades protesting beside them. Even if the intent of the original call from the river to the sea wasn't a call to exterminate or expel Jews from Palestine/Israel, it may impact those fearing for Jews' safety within and outside of Israel-Palestine. Footnote: for a discussion of the original intent of this call, see Maha Nassar's article, From the River to the Sea Doesn't Mean What You Think It Means, published in the foreword. End footnote. Left solidarity with Jews asked leftists to Paris calls to end the occupation with a commitment to support peace and democracy-seeking Jewish Israelis and Palestinians they see as having the potential to co-create a shared and dignified free society. Solidarity with Palestinians, solidarity with Jewish Israelis, both and. Left solidarity with Jews also asks us to reconsider questioning Jewish comrades about their position on Palestine/Israel. Such questioning is rightly seen as a microaggression when directed, for example, towards Chinese or Indian Americans asked about their position on policies of the Chinese or Indian governments. As David Baddiel suggests, affording cultural sensitivity to Jews is integral to a leftist ethos of mutual respect. Being a left Jewish ally also entails critically engaging with comrades who celebrate or qualify the Hamas massacre. Additionally, allyship can mean sharing the grief of Jewish comrades impacted by a horrific event like the 7th of October massacre. As few vigils for the victims of October 7th were held across the world by descendants of religious majority leftists, descendants of religious majority solidarity came primarily and graciously from faith-based organizations in Muslim, Christian, and Buddhist communities, which is a beautiful thing. A left committed to Jewish solidarity will one day soon hopefully show the same grace. Supporting Jewish leftists also means interrupting anti-Jewish racism when it surfaces in university settings. Footnote. See Amna Nawaz's article, Israel-Hamas war leads to increase of anti-Semitic threats on college campuses. See also Tess Owens' article, Hijack pro-Palestine protests. Neo-Nazis are showing up at protests to push anti-Semitic conspiracies and tropes in the mainstream. Published with Vice. College campuses are historically vital spaces where teachers and students generate rich intellectual cultures and politics. Yet since October 7th, many campuses, particularly in the U.S., have become spaces where some leftists communicate instrumental and careless hate rather than cultivate principled and respectful discussion. Far-right groups, including neo-Nazis, are using debates about the war on and off college campuses to unite the right and left by weaponizing anti-Jewish racism as a way to speak critically about Palestine/Israel. Again, a more anti-racist and principled left can do better. We can deepen our sensitivity towards Jewish comrades by recognizing the ongoing impact on Jews who endured a 19th century of continuous massacres, pogroms, followed by a Holocaust, followed by yet more pogroms. The redemptive power of history is that it offers us an opportunity to cultivate empathy with others who have faced unspeakable histories. It is essential for leftists to understand that many Israelis and U.S. Jews today are the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of Holocaust or pogrom survivors, who in turn are descendants of centuries of Jewish struggle. The left begins to humanize Jews as we cease to confuse Jewish striving for safety with a striving for power. Left solidarity with Jews also means interrupting accusations that Jews, quote, weaponize the Holocaust and that they, quote, use concerns about anti-Jewish racism as a manipulative or cynical cudgel. Such statements trivialize the ripple effect of generational trauma that is very real, particularly among Ashkenazi comrades within and outside of Palestine/Israel. Footnote. For a short discussion of Jewish generational trauma tied to the October 7th massacre, see Dara Horn's article, Why Jews Can't Stop Shaking Right Now, published in the New York Times, October 22nd, 2023. A left that empathizes with Jews' fear of a genocidal history repeating itself may indeed lead one day to a collective leftist call of, quote, never again. For many decades now, leftists have acknowledged the ongoing impact of centuries of chattel slavery and colonialism on descendants of formerly enslaved Africans and indigenous people globally. Footnote. See Maurice Opry, From the Events of History to a Sense of History, Aspects of Transgenerational Trauma and Brutality in the African American Experience, published in 2004. And footnote. An actively anti-racist view of history may be also extended to Jewish histories. There is no statute of limitations for generational trauma, as time does not heal wounds. Only by institutionalizing anti-racist principles and action may we begin to heal the wounds of racial hatred for all dehumanized by racism, wounds that are 500 years in the making. Left solidarity with Jews also means distinguishing the Israeli people from the right-wing Israeli government. Leftists tend to understand we can't hold the U.S. populace responsible for rising white nationalism and Trumpism. We also know that we can't hold Palestinians in Gaza responsible for the atrocities of Hamas. In the same vein, the left can't hold the Israeli populace responsible for Israel's right-wing religious fanatics or for the authoritarianism of the Netanyahu government. Footnote. The story of the Israeli left is complex, fraught, and sorrowing, as is the case of the U.S. left and in much of the world today. The Israeli left faces two main challenges in the form of, one, an influx of Jews from Russia, Middle Eastern, and North African countries who tend toward political conservatism. That's very important. There's consistently this kind of push to divide Jews between Jews of color and white Jews, and act as if like the one side is the Jews of color versus the white Ashkenazi Jews are progressive, and the white Ashkenazi Jews are the ones that are, the colonizers or whatever. But in fact, much of the support for the Netanyahu government does not comes from the Mizrahi population. People have this idea because there was the Black Panther movement, I believe it was called, in Israel, which protested against discriminations against Jews that were not from Europe. That the Mizrahi in general constitute a left, which is inaccurate. Obviously, you can't. There's there's consistently this idea on the left of minorities having some inherent tendency towards progressive politics, but that's not the case, and it's not the case in Israel. 2. An unrelenting set of failures among movements for peace between Israel and Palestine, repeatedly thwarted by right-wing factions in the Israeli government, as well as authoritarian and religious forces that stymie the Palestinian peace movement. For a concise discussion of the Israeli left, see Ian Buruma in the article, Ian Baruma's article, What Became of the Israeli Left? End footnote. The Israeli left has innumerable challenges, including growing religiosity among more recently immigrated Jews and a peace process thwarted by extremists in Israel. In Palestine, too, religious authoritarians have worked to impede Palestinians working toward a future of coexistence. Yeah, and to my understanding, at least, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but to my understanding, Jews in like the people in the Zionist movement who disagreed with partition were not treated to a barrage of terror by the Zionist movement at large, even if they might have been isolated or excluded, or their position didn't become the dominant one. But I know in Palestine, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who again, Amin al-Husseini, who lived in Berlin until the end of the war, organized SS forces, I believe, in Bosnia. Definitely, those groups who definitely engaged in terrorism or coercion against people who so-called collaborators or people who accepted partition. I'm not sure of the final details of that, but I know that to be true. To my understanding, I'll just move on. Never mind. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm not an expert. In Palestine, too, religious authoritarians have worked to impede Palestinian working toward a future of coexistence. Despite these formidable obstacles, there remains a core of committed activists and organizations in Israel and Palestine that keep the hope of peace, inclusion, and democracy alive. Israeli progressives and leftists need the solidarity of leftists internationally as they fight for a two-state federal or confederated society. Ironically or tragically, the Israeli left saw a robust resurgence of pro-peace and pro-democracy activism in the months leading up to October 7th. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis protested daily against the Israeli right with the objective of removing Netanyahu from office. Footnote: for an overview of the pro-democracy protest against Netanyahu, see Charles Enderlin's article, Historic Demonstrations Against Netanyahu's Judicial Reforms, published in Le Monde Diplomatique. End footnote. If we haven't heard of these movements, it's because the right-wing Israeli press and sadly the left media generally report little on these movements. Leftists around the world were surprised to learn that among the Jewish slaughtered or kidnapped from kibbutz Be'eri are leftists who have fought for Palestinian rights and inclusion for decades. Vivian Silver is but one of the 200 hostages taken by Hamas. She is a leader of Women Wage Peace, a large grassroots movement created after the Gaza War of 2014, working towards a peaceful resolution for Palestine/Israel. Left solidarity with Jews means knowing the names of Israelis like Vivian Silver, as well as those of her comrades taken hostage. Wikipedia says Vivian Silver lived from 1949 to 2023 and was a Canadian-Israeli peace activist and women's rights activist. She was murdered in the Be'eri massacre, part of the 7th of October attacks. Back to the text. We can do better by learning about organizations and movements that are political homes to many of the murdered and kidnapped. That include less radical organizations such as Coalition Against Racism in Israel, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and Israelis Against Racism. There are also inspiring secular peace-seeking feminist and anti-racist organizations with whom the international left may feel more alignment and solidarity that range from Women in Black, Ayush, the Da'am Workers' Party, to Hadash, and Breaking the Silence. These organizations may not fully support the stateless vision embraced by many left radicals, but they are a sign that there are people on the ground seeking a different path forward. And as the left generates curiosity about an Israeli left with which we may feel aligned, we will indeed find the individuals, groups, and communities with whom we can open dialogue and relationships of solidarity. Reclaiming our ethical mooring as leftists means building on the legacies of the Zapatistas, Kurds, and anti-authoritarian black leaders who held fast to left ideals. When leftists see Zionism as having been an ideological force that drove European Jewish refugees after the Holocaust to seek asylum in Israel-Palestine, they fail to understand Jewish history. The vast majority of these refugees did not want to go to Israel and would have been grateful to live in the U.S., Canada, or in Britain, but no country would take them. Most of these refugees in 1947 hailed not from assimilated Western European cities or countries. They were mainly rural shtetl dwellers. Think Fiddler on the Roof. And many were illiterate religious people unfamiliar with the anti-statist Zionism of Martin Buber, or with ideological Zionism generally. And even if there was a universe in which these refugees had been exposed to thinkers like Buber, they had no access to living and breathing exemplars of left idealism, as we have today among the Zapatistas and revolutionary Kurds, that may have opened the way toward federal or confederal formations that transcend a nationalistic framework. The left has reached a historical moment where another world is indeed possible in Israel-Palestine, if the minds, hearts, and imagination of the Palestinian and Israeli people work together in unison. If the utopian reach of these words seems naive or engenders criticism, it may be a sign that we need to reclaim our revolutionary nerve as well as our unapologetically idealist vision. Every revolution, every humanistic endeavor for social and political justice emerged from a shining cauldron of ideals. These ideals have moored revolutionaries to their principles, buoying them to keep moving the arc of history forward, even when facing moments of weariness that are part of the long struggle for freedom. This is a horrific moment to be a Palestinian struggling to survive in Gaza while fearing for the many who will continue to perish during this war. This is a terrifying time for Palestinians in Gaza who are aware of being used as human shields. This is an appalling time for Jews of conscience living in Israel, witnessing their government commit mass murder while they themselves also face an existential threat. Powerful nations can indeed, at their whim, determine Israeli Jews as, quote, collateral loss, should they choose to reconfigure the Middle East in a more expedient geopolitical order. This is also a trying time to be a non-Israeli Jew, watching anti-Jewish racism combust across the world, wondering if this is the beginning of yet another period of massive Jewish exclusion, violence, and death. It is a deeply painful time for all Jewish humanists who grieve Palestinian devastation that is approaching the, quote, legal international definition of genocide. The left loses its integrity when we support or remain silent or apologetic regarding authoritarian entities like Hamas that denounce every value the left stands for. We regain our integrity when we hold fast to our principles and compassion for every human being, because if the left is anything, it is a dream for humanity rising toward principled freedom. As leftists, we must identify and support members of both the Palestinian and Israeli left who seek a world that reflects our ideals of democracy, social justice, and a culture of ethnic and religious freedom and inclusion. When we fail to mourn the loss of any human life, we are a left that's lost its humanity. For leftists to recapture our shared moral compass, we must find and support those who seek anti-authoritarian, fully anti-racist, feminist, queer, and truly democratic futures, wherever and whomever the seeds for such futures lie. We must lift up all freedom-seeking people as they build new institutions shaped by a logic of democracy and a radically inclusive humanism that sees that a life is a life, no matter whose body, whose heart that life is beating in. Chaia Heller is a writer, or Chaia, I'm not sure, is a teacher, activist, anthropologist, and artist who has been teaching political and feminist theory at the Institute for Social Ecology for nearly 4 decades and taught science and technological studies, food politics, and gender studies for nearly a decade at Mount Holyoke College. Chaia has been active in movements ranging from the feminist, ecofeminist, the left-green movements, to the global justice movement and Occupy. Chaia is the author of The Ecology of Everyday Life, published with Black Rose Books, and Food, Farms, and Solidarity, published with Duke University Press. When not engaged in teaching and writing about political issues, Chaia is engaged in painting and creative writing. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.